Fueling Wall Street's boom was the consolidation of American industries into giant conglomerates known as trusts.
Trusts, as they were called in the 19th century, were essentially monopolies. They were attempts by various businesses to take control of the entire industry.
There were trusts in sugar and rubber, in rope, in copper. The largest trust of all was the United States Steel Corporation, which controlled about 45% of the American steel industry to begin with.
But many Americans hated the trusts.
These men were able to purchase enormous amounts of political power and to do pretty much whatever they wanted without much government regulation.
One of their most outspoken critics was President Theodore Roosevelt, who called the trust bosses the malefactors of wealth.
Theodore Roosevelt, even though he was considered the trust buster, sort of knew that the Wall Street financiers weren't hurt when trusts were broken up. In fact, he said in one of his campaign speeches, Wall Street's prayer is, "Oh, merciful Providence, please give us another dissolution." Really, the shareholder wasn't affected by the breakup of a company.
The financier who took much of the heat was J.P. Morgan, the guiding force behind many of the trusts, and an awesome and intimidating figure. The photographer Edward Steichen compared meeting his piercing gaze with confronting the headlights of an oncoming train.
If one could step off the tracks, they were merely awe-inspiring. If one could not, they were terrifying.
No modern figure in the late 20th century could have anywhere near the kind of power that Pierpont Morgan wielded at the turn of the last century. The jobs he was doing are now being done more or less by Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin until recently, the IMF, the World Bank, Warren Buffett, and George Soros.
At the height of J.P. Morgan's career, it was said that merely to be seen walking down the front steps of the Morgan Bank with J.P. Morgan was enough to make a man's career.
Morgan firmly believed consolidation helped the economy by improving efficiency and ending cutthroat competition that bankrupted companies. But his critics thought his motives were greed and power. Wall Street paid little attention to the trust critics as the market grew, but booms often nurture the seed of their own destruction. In 1907, what started as a bank crisis spread among Wall Street's nervous investors.
The 1907 panic had a variety of causes. One of them was that we had an absolutely antiquated banking system in this country that had been devised for the pre-Civil War agrarian economy. It wasn't at all ready to handle a modern industrial financial system. The actual trigger in the United States was a copper speculation that failed, and that it was just the match that lit this tinderbox on fire.
In those days, before the FDIC and other reforms of the 1930s, if your bank failed, you lost all the money you had in it. You know, your life savings could simply disappear.
As the crisis threatened to topple one bank after another, J.P. Morgan took charge.
Morgan came to New York and appointed a team of younger men to do research for him about which banks were in good shape. And when they found one that seemed to be in very sound shape, it was just threatened by having the depositors all want their money back, he said, this is the place to stop the panic. He then called in the older bankers, and they essentially raised millions of dollars to supply to this trust company so that it could stay afloat. It could meet its depositors' demands and not fold in the midst of this crisis.
At the height of the panic of 1907, the president of the New York Stock Exchange walked across Broad Street to Morgan's office and told him the exchange would have to close to prevent brokers from failing.
Morgan flatly forbade it to do so and raised $27 million in about 15 minutes flat to provide the liquidity needed to keep the stock exchange open.
Toward the very end of the 3 weeks of this panic, Morgan calls all the presidents of the major banks who were in trouble into his private library on 36th Street, which is filled with Gutenberg Bibles and Renaissance Madonnas.
Morgan sat in the West Room, his office, before the fireplace, playing endless games of solitaire and smoking cigars, despite a bad cold. Morgan's private secretary, Belle Green, came in.
Why don't you tell them what to do, Mr. Morgan?
I don't know what to do myself, but sometime someone will come in with a plan that I know will work, and then I will tell them what to do.
Morgan has locked the door, and nobody is going to leave this building until they come to a solution to the crisis. And by 4 o'clock in the morning, Morgan drafts a statement, takes it into the trust company presidents and says, this is what you're going to do, here's the statement, and here's a pen, sign it. One of his strengths in his entire career was his decisiveness. He was a man of action.
Theodore Roosevelt, who had blasted Morgan and his colleagues, now praised those conservative and substantial businessmen who in this crisis acted with such wisdom and public spirit. In the panic's aftermath, it was clear the U.S. needed a lender of last resort, an institution strong enough that it could take instant action in a financial crisis. That institution, the Federal Reserve, was established in 1913. J.P. Morgan died the same year.
Morgan's death provoked an extraordinary reaction for a private individual who had never held public office. Within 24 hours, over 5,000 telegrams poured into the hotel in Rome where he had died, including telegrams from the Pope and the Emperor of Germany and the King of England. And his body was brought back to New York, and there was a huge funeral at St. George's Church where he had faithfully attended for many, many years.
So when his estate was probated and it was figured out that he was worth about $80 million, people were astonished. That wasn't nearly as much money as they thought Morgan had. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and several other people were worth a lot more money. And supposedly, Rockefeller, reading about Morgan's net worth in the New York Times, shook his head and said, and to think he wasn't even a rich man.